discuss this collaborative opportunity between the City of Rock Island and the Rock Island Arsenal. First off, I would like to introduce two guests tonight that are here from the Rock Island Arsenal, and they are Colonel Moore, who is the Garrison Commander for the Arsenal, and Mr. John Ramsdale, who is the Chief of Plans Analysis and Integration Office. Tonight we'll be discussing what an IGSA is, how it relates to the City of Rock Island, and the benefits to the city, the community, and the Rock Island Arsenal. So what is an IGSA? An IGSA is short for Intergovernmental Support Agreement. It's an agreement between the Army and a state or local government that serves the best interests of both parties and can be used as one of many authorities to achieve a win-win partnership. IGSAs allow state and local governments the ability to provide, receive, or share installation support services. IGSA's periods of performance is up to 10 years and can be extended in 10-year increments if mutually agreed upon. This slide here is the current amount of IGSAs that are in effect across the United States. As you can see, there's 55 IGSAs currently approved or executed, and 76% of the IGSAs are agreements with municipal services related, so infrastructure, public works related items. Also with that is emergency medical services at 13%, environmental at 9%, and education training at 2%. So the City of Rock Island and Rock Island Arsenal are currently working together and have been for quite some time. In March of 2019, the City of Rock Island and City of Moline entered into an IGSA agreement to provide automated refuse collection for approximately 80 residential homes on the Rock Island Arsenal. The start date was April 1st, 2019, as a 5-year agreement. The result is a cost-effective solid waste collection and enhanced relationship with the Rock Island Arsenal and surrounding communities. Also, the City of Rock Island has a long-standing relationship with the Rock Island Arsenal with collection of wastewater from the Rock Island Arsenal dating back to 1968. By collaborating on these additional services, the city will strengthen the relationships that already exist. So before the IGSA concept was, the direction was privatization of the Arsenal utilities. The Pentagon was pursuing privatization infrastructure on the Arsenal. The city had been pursuing/discussing this privatization off and on since 2005. Back in February of 2016, the city issued an RFQ for professional services to assist with bid submission for this privatization, and in May of 2016, we selected a consultant at a cost of $82,600. Funding was budgeted each year to pursue that privatization. However, the bid proposal was never issued for the city to take action due to the federal government pursuing the current plan, which is the IGSA concept that we're discussing tonight. So how did we get here? In October of 18, we had several interested parties, such as Bettendorf, Rock Island, Moline, Davenport, Milan, and others, meet at a kickoff meeting to discuss this opportunity. In December, Rock Island staff met with the Arsenal, and we continued a discussion on IGSA concepts. In January of 2019, we attended a workshop along with the City of Moline and did some facility tours. In March of 19, IGSA was signed between Moline and Rock Island for the refuse collection that we just discussed, and we began collecting refuse for 80 residential homes. In September of 2019, we submitted estimating pricing for sewer and electrical maintenance only for the IGSA. And in October of 19, we met with the Rock Island Arsenal to discuss water, sewer, and electrical maintenance. And as of late December of 19, we submitted estimating for pricing for water, sewer, and electrical maintenance. So this project summary in front of you is straight from the performance work summary that the Rock Island Arsenal provided all municipalities, and it identifies the tasks needed to perform the different scopes of work. As you can see, the scope of work are items that the city already does on a daily basis, but at a much larger scale. Our current water treatment supervisor was acquired from the Rock Island Arsenal and ran that plant, so we have a lot of additional knowledge on plant operations. In addition to staff knowledge, Our current water plant that we have operated for the past 100 years is very similar to the Arsenal's water plant. All sampling identified in the service summary will be done by our chemists at our own City Rock Island labs. Any questions so far? I know I'm kind of going through this fast. This is the project summary continued and goes over the street light and traffic signal maintenance portion, the electrical maintenance portion of the contract or proposal, and also the wastewater treatment. Wastewater treatment, as we discussed, we already do that, have since 1968. We think that this IGSA will capture and update an old wastewater treatment agreement from 1968, last updated in 1972, and consolidate these two agreements into one, and will allow for billing of all services on one invoice instead of two. So the project details, this could be a 10-year agreement and can be extended in 10-year agreements if mutually agreed upon. For the City of Rock Island to provide Rock Island Arsenal water treatment plant operations and maintenance, wastewater collection, maintenance, street light and traffic signal, electrical maintenance, and sewage treatment. The city would be responsible for operational maintenance and would be the agreement contract holder for maintenance and operation. The federal government is responsible for emergency repairs, capital projects, and EPA mandates. So this is a project timeline here that we formulated. Obviously, we're sitting here tonight talking in study session. The next step would be come back to City Council with what we've identified in our project proposals and get a official approval to move forward. But the reason for the study session was to have a conversation and get a verbal approval from the council tonight to continue that next step and come back to council for that agreement. If you were to approve that step, then we would come back in June or July with the final agreement back to council for final approval. And then we would look at City Rock Island taking over services no later than April of 2021. So these are some of the IGSA benefits that we've identified that the Arsenal and the City of Rock Island would both receive. Obviously, on the city side, we can expect some new revenues from this, increased buying power for our enterprise and general funds, improvement of city operations and city infrastructure, and jobs and money stay local. Mutually, we feel that there would be economic benefits and cost savings, strategic regional collaboration, improved government and community relationships, and efficiencies between us both. So some specific benefits that we've identified to the city is 80% of our current maintenance electrician employees' salary would be paid by this electrical IGSA, which is a cost savings to the general fund. Additional revenue for the water and sewer enterprise funds from the IGSA agreement would be received. Additional personnel hired to cover these responsibilities of the IGSA agreement. Additional personnel hired to cover responsibilities of the IGSA will also complete other city functions unrelated to the IGSA. All employee costs for additional personnel hired are covered in the IGSA contract. Additional benefits to the city will be increased maintenance and weekly inspections of 7 lift stations, additional manpower for snow plowing operations, implementation of water valve exercising program, and emergency situations such as water main break repairs. So to summarize, why should we consider the IGSA with the Rock Island Arsenal? Because providing infrastructure to the Rock Island Arsenal has been a goal for the city of Rock Island for well over a decade. Funding has been spent in various ways to achieve this goal, but the opportunity has not been available in the past. An opportunity now exists to bring in additional revenues and offset expenditures for the next decade and beyond. And this collaborative effort would open up a longer-term arrangement with regard to providing utilities in the future should that opportunity present itself. So in closing, I would like to mention that the Arsenal is the second largest employer in the Quad Cities. This story would tell the Quad Cities and Rock Island residents a good story about collaboration, public-public partnerships, revenue generation, improvement of city operations, and economic benefits. Also, this is not new to the city of Rock Island. As mentioned, we have been working under an IGSA agreement for the past year with refuse collection on the arsenal and been providing wastewater treatment to the arsenal since 1968. I'd like to thank the mayor and city council for your time and ask that you allow Public Works and our Rock Island Arsenal to continue the discussion forward to where we can draft a concept agreement with the arsenal and begin operation and maintenance of the arsenal infrastructure in April of '21. So you have any questions?
Real quick, Mike. So again, first of all, I'd like to say this is a great idea, and I personally welcome this opportunity. And now, a question here, and obviously we don't know any specifics, but has there been any study on projected revenue increases that would?
Yeah, we've done that study. Total contract of what we currently have identified is about 20% in revenue back to the city. I know that doesn't give you a number, and I'm really not
Nope, I
wanting to
understand.
disclose that cost, but,
Okay.
because it's still a working document, we still haven't received approval, and that's really the next step, is get
Yep.
that approved.
But again, thank you very much for your hard work on this, and I think it's a great opportunity for the city to get involved with this.
Thank you. Yes, Alderman Spaghettis.
I'm going to go back to page 13, and under specific benefits to the city. By the way, overall, it seems like a great opportunity for Rock Island and for the Arsenal. As far as additional personnel hired
Yes, sir.
and all employee costs for additional personnel covered by the IGSA contract, does that include wages and benefits?
It does. Yes.
So the Arsenal's, I don't know about the terms of the contract yet, are they paying a percentage of that or all of that?
So we're billing that back to the arsenal. So the entire cost plus the markup of, with the benefits would be billed back to them. So all of our contract costs are covered in this IGSA agreement.
And then the other question I have is, are those employees that are hired for this particular reason, even though that they're gonna be used on other city projects as well, is their employment tied to the length of the contract?
So we would have to negotiate that with the union. If this moves forward, that would be the next step, that we would sit down with the union. I feel that the union would welcome this, bringing in additional union personnel. They usually don't frown on that. Yeah, so I don't personally see it being tied to a contract. Our hope is that the contract goes good. Like I said, we're used to this type of work. This is what we do and have done for a long time. And, you know, we would hope to see that 10-year agreement go through and renew for another 10-year agreement. And, you know, we would learn things along the way about efficiencies and, you know, troubles as well, and adapt to those. And so we could look at through attrition, people retiring. If need be, we could pull back that number.
So do you have a guesstimate as to how many additional employees you might wanna hire?
Yeah, we're looking at three water operators and one maintenance electrician too. So, or not a maintenance electrician, maintenance worker too, which is basically a operator in our water distribution department. And obviously the three water operators would be responsible for the operation of the water plant.
So a total of 4 full-time employees.
Correct.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Just to make sure I understand the scope of the project, we're talking about plant operations, or we're talking about the infrastructure as well, like the water lines under the ground?
Yep. It would be water distribution, so valve exercising, fire hydrant repairs, flushing, and then also the same for the sewer distribution, televising, vectoring, cleaning of the mains. We would be in charge of inspecting their number of lift stations that they have, which we already do. And then the treatment part, which that's already tied in.
Yeah, so there is emergency situations such as water main break repairs listed up there. So just as currently the city of Rock Island is responsible to repair, whether with our emergency contractor list or with our own public works employees, would we be would we be required to repair the emergency brakes for the water system on the Arsenal too? Is that within
no.
the scope of this?
We would not be, if the Arsenal were to choose us, we would go ahead and do those repairs. It would be an added cost to the contract.
Okay. So I guess what I'm thinking, and I believe you said it earlier, that they are still responsible for capital improvements,
They
things
are.
like that. So we are not taking on any of the federal government's obligations with respect to maintaining the pipes in the ground.
Correct. So like, for instance, at the treatment plant, there's equipment inside there that needs pumps, motors, things of that nature that are spec'd out in this performance work summary that we've reviewed, that we would be responsible for the regular maintenance of that. But if those items failed, that would be a responsibility of the Arsenal to repair or replace.
All right, that helps clarify that. And then there was also, like traffic lights and things like that, or
Yeah,
street lights.
Street lights and traffic signals, and some exterior lighting on some of the facilities there. So like the gates, the security gates where you come in, that type of lighting we would be responsible for. And there's a specification in there that says approximately how many we could expect to do. So it's like there's eight lights a week replaced, 52 ballasts a year. So we're looking at one ballast a week. It's very specific on what's required of us.
And that would be us repairing those things, not just maintenance, like, hey, by the way, a light's out, and then they would be responsible to repair it.
That's
We would be
correct.
responsible for actually repairing the light.
Correct. We have a material price that we've worked up based off of what they've, it's basically like they put out a bid and
Yeah.
we've summarized what it would cost. We went over there and looked at all this. We've done probably 4 or 5 tours with our city electricians and actually have spoke with the contractor who does the work over there currently.
Yeah. We have, do we have one city electrician?
2.
We have 2. And so with 80%, we're not hiring an extra electrician with this agreement, correct? We're just offsetting some of the expense of us maintaining.
Correct.
I mean, we just signed well, maybe not signed, but we just agreed to a energy performance contract because a number of our streetlights are not running. Do we, I mean, we have the capacity to handle our streetlights and the Arsenal streetlights when we have lots of streetlights currently not lit in this city?
Yeah, we had the capacity to fix those streetlights. We didn't have the revenue. So that's the difference there is, we've been
Are
trying
you
to
talking
get.
about like parts for because we're already paying for the electrician, right?
Correct. Yeah, for the parts or whatever contracts would be needed to fix those repairs.
Okay,
Yeah, the revenue just wasn't there to do that.
okay, so,
We budget a certain amount of money, but it's not enough to do everything that we need on that end. So the performance contract is that step to get that to that level.
right, so, yeah, what I'm getting to here is concern that we be able to meet our need for repairing our streetlights and our customers, right? We want to make sure that we can fulfill the obligations of a contract.
Sure, I
So it's
understand.
not necessarily a matter of not having enough electricians, it's just we haven't been able to pay for the
It's been
parts and stuff like
funding
that
related.
for ours, okay. And that type of work would be done by our public works employees, our electrician?
would.
Wouldn't it
So
be
there-
subcontracted?
There's an item in there, water tower lighting. We don't replace water tower lighting, so we would contract that out, and we've got pricing for that. So, and that goes the same for the water and sewer work as well. There's some items in there like backflow prevention testing. We don't do that in-house. We don't have a licensed plumber, so, or on the public works side anyway. So we have a company do that already does our work for us.
Okay. 2 more questions, sorry. I imagine there's going to be performance metrics or something equivalent included in this that holds us accountable to the Arsenal? Is that right?
Yeah, there is, and yeah, you're more than welcome to tie in, because I don't know that as much as.
So the agreement will basically outline the broad parameters of what needs to be conducted with a performance work statement that does cover those metrics and those parameters of what needs to be conducted when and to what quality, for lack of a better term. No different than the standard contract that we already have in place.
Right.
Basically just taking that contract, mirroring the requirements under this agreement. Mike's taking a look at it and has indicated that he feels he's got the capacity in this staff.
All right. Thank you very much. For this last question, it's really more a question for the arsenal. I don't know if you or the colonel want to come up to the microphone so that everybody watching online or at home can hear. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for being here tonight. Does this, generally speaking, I know that an ongoing goal, I suppose you could say, of the arsenal is to remain here, right? BRAC and things like that. Is something like this, would that help sell the arsenal remaining if at some point in the future there are talks about BRAC with respect to the arsenal? I mean, would this intergovernmental agreement kind of score you higher up points or however that's figured? And do you see that as being beneficial?
I do. So just real quick before I get to, the eggs, I just want to thank Mayor, councilmen and women, just for having us here and for entertaining this. This is a great opportunity, I think, for both the city of Rock Island and Rock Island Arsenal. And I just want to, I don't get this opportunity very often, so while I do own the podium for a bit, just want to say thanks for the support that you give both the uniformed service members and the Department of the Army civilians that we have at Rock Island Arsenal that live and work there, and most importantly, that live here in your community. It is fantastic, and we certainly appreciate that. With respect to your question on, kind of quote-unquote BRAC-proofing the installation, that's something that's talked about quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that going forward, the ties between an installation and the community around it are a huge part of that. Every time that Congress has authorized a reduction of bases around the country, there's a different set of criteria, a different set of evaluation standards, if you will, to take a look at that. What that'll be for the next round, I don't know. But what we've seen in the past is where there is a strong relationship between the installation and the community that surrounds it, where you can identify, those specific linkages between the installation and the community. This would be one of them. Obviously a contract, a monetary exchange between the two entities. Yes, that does strengthen that. It's a signal to the a signal back up to the department that that location, that installation is viable going forward because you do have that level of community support. Absolutely.
Well, good. I want to do everything that I can to BRAC-proof the arsenal, so appreciate that.
Let me add to that a little bit. I mean, I've sit on several committees, and we've talked about this with Colonel Martin, that sort of thing. And I know they've had larger military installations that have saved millions of dollars on doing this type of a program. And so hopefully it's the old cliche of win-win-win. They save, we can obviously make a few extra dollars, cover some new revenues for us, and also show the support and everything else. And it's relatively, I'll say new, if I remember right, that they're doing this with a lot of different services, mowing the grass, cleaning services, and all different kinds of things on the island, instead of having to use big national contracts or and everything else, that they localize it more. But it's been with municipalities. Now, the municipality can third-party it out, but for the most part, they need to work with municipalities directly with the contract. But and I know that we've looked at several of those other issues, and at this point haven't found it to quite fit into our needs either. But this one, they've done a great job.
And that's a great point, Mayor. So, from the Arsenal's perspective, we're not asking to get cut a break or to, be charged less than anybody else. Just by virtue of not being subject to the federal acquisition regulation and some of the overhead associated with working underneath the FAR, that decreases our overhead. My responsibility as the garrison commander is to integrate services across the installation. So I do that with a large base operations contract. The larger and the broader that portfolio of your base operations contract, the more that you bring underneath that contract, the more eventually it gets subcontracted out by your lead contractor. You know, you have very few organizations that can do everything. So with that subcontracting actions, you have, you know, an increase of price. You have the overhead, the management of those contracts, all of the administrative fees associated with subcontracting the items out there. So just by virtue of being able to pull this out of that overall base operations contract, work this singularly with the City of Rock Island Arsenal, with the City of Rock Island, not underneath the federal acquisition regulation, and then looking at that 10-year timeframe as well, to spread out costs that are associated on both sides over 10 years, and then the ability to non-competitively renew that for another 10 years down the road gives us a lot of flexibility, and that's where we see most of the savings on our side. And then on the city side, Mike detailed that out with, you know, some of the increased revenue streams to the City of Rock Island.
And go back to the BRAC a little bit and talk about this and talk enough to be dangerous, I guess, on these topics. But when they actually are looking at for projects in the foundry side of this especially, but even still, they have to bid on it. Even internally with the government, federal government, they have to bid on these projects. And they have to take into account typically a lot of the expenses they have on the island. And whether it be empty buildings or not, they're saying, we still got to heat them and maintain them and everything else. And so that's dead overhead. And so sometimes it makes them uncompetitive in bidding projects, internally or externally. When they're doing, so the more they can save and reduce their expenses on things like this, along with other things, can help them be more competitive when they're bidding on projects for other military divisions, or obviously the busier they are, and the harder people look at when it does come to BRAC or funds, capital funds for their facility. We've been very fortunate. I think just recently you got like $20 million for some more capital, so it really kind of flows all the way down to helping out in a lot of different ways. Also, I guess let people know we've been very collaborative and cooperative with other cities, and Moline specifically and everything else, not to bid against each other on some of these things. There's no sense of the municipalities here locally competing against these things and driving our costs down and not making it worthwhile for anybody. We've continued to work with our fellow cities and on who's going to bid on and work with in different projects, like we did for the waste, recycling, that sort of thing.
Which to date has been a fantastic program.
Yes.
You know, that one was a little bit different for us. It was more, I guess, cost neutral on our perspective. We didn't save any money going into that agreement. We did get better service and more services through the agreement than we had before. So cost neutral with better services, I'll take that as well.
Absolutely. You have another question?
One more question for Mike Bartels. We talked about additional personnel. What additional expenses do you estimate we might have in terms of equipment and supplies, things that we can't do the job with what we have right now?
So the materials part of that is, it's already identified in the contract, so those costs are already included in the contract. Equipment-wise, no, we already have the proper equipment to do the jobs already. And matter of fact, some of these revenues would help us try to purchase that additional equipment that's not in the greatest condition, like a bucket truck. So that's another reason why we're pushing for this, is to try to use some of those revenues to improve our equipment.
Very good, thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just want to make it perfectly clear that this is not going to cost the citizens money. It is actually going to be beneficial to the citizens of Rock Island. And I want to thank you and Colonel, thank you for, you know, the Arsenal has always been a good neighbor to Rock Island. So,
And Colonel Marr's been exceptional at that and getting out in the community and involved, and along with other military. Let me ask this, and just for clarification, I think I know the answer, but we are maintaining or working with their water filtration plant, not using ours, and I assume that's because the military still wants to be independent, sort of self-sustaining at this point.
So we have the infrastructure. It is a little bit old, but it works. Having that infrastructure there, and you talked a little bit earlier about the whole privatization effort. The Army went down the privatization road. Department of Defense went down the privatization road, and it was cost prohibitive in many respects. And so, yes, it would be using the existing infrastructure at Rock Island Arsenal, our water purification plant, our distribution system. Like Mike said earlier in his response to a great question, from Mr. Parker, I believe it was, about, we're still responsible for the capital infrastructure for the capital improvement projects there. It's really the preventative maintenance side that the city would be focused on. But yes, it is using our existing infrastructure, and part of that is part of the reason, because that allows us to have a level of mission assurance and resiliency in our water supply system, which is important.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Report up here.
I did have a quick question. A bit of an elephant in the room. At the last study session, we had a presentation about privatizing the city's water system. I mean, it appears, are we at a fork in the road here? I mean, I can't imagine how, I mean, if we enter into this agreement with the Department of Defense and then we decide to sell our water infrastructure, I mean, how, is it null and void then? Is the Arsenal not interested? How do we as a council merge these competing, in my perspective, policies, right? I mean, it's the elephant in the room, but
Well, we would still have a contract to provide services, but we're not moving down that road at this time. We just had an informational presentation, but we are in a contract to provide services for the duration of the contract. So if we were to make any changes in the future, it would have to be in mind that the city is still obligated to provide these services at the cost outlined in the contract.
And it can be we can submit it to a private contractor, but the contract's still with the municipality. And that's what that's the law out there that has to be is municipality has to have the contract. We can privatize, but obviously being a large client, we would consult with them if we were to go down that road.
Right.
And make sure that there's mutually agreed upon.
yeah, certainly. I just thought it'd be wise if that's being considered, and if that would null this or something, then it would be more prudent for us to say, okay, we're gonna go down this road, not this road, instead of going down this road and then careening this way and trying to make the square peg fit in the round hole, right? So I appreciate the answers.
Okay? Thank you very much for your time,
Thank you.
your commitment.
Thank you.
I think the chief thinks he's gonna be called upon.
Come on down.
Welcome to the front, Chief. Hello, everyone. We're back again with part two.
Part 3, part 4, something.
For the sake of time, I'm really going to whip through these slides, okay? So if you end up with questions at the end, that's okay. I just want to try to be respectful and allow us to have as much time for dialogue as we need. So, talking about cannabis clubs, lounges, and cafes. What exactly is going on? As a recap, the state has empowered municipalities to permit retail tobacco stores to allow on-site consumption of cannabis in addition to the on-site consumption of tobacco, assuming they meet a certain set of criteria, okay? You, as the policymakers, have a set of options to pick from in light of this. One is to take no immediate action and to revisit this subject in the future. 2 is to take a hard line and adopt language to explicitly prohibit this. And then 3 is to direct staff to develop some language that you would adopt then to allow for this, okay? Those are the 3 choices we're entertaining. What are we not talking about? Okay. So it was mentioned previously that there is this marijuana lounge that opened in Springfield. This is not actually an example of what we're talking about. This lounge is actually part of a dispensary business, which we have already approved, okay? So we have already approved of state licensed cannabis dispensing businesses that have on-site consumption, right? So that's already been approved as part of our zoning. We're going to allow them in all industrial and business zoning districts except B1. And we don't need to address this right now, okay? The news coverage of this subject can sometimes be a little bit difficult to parse out. This got a lot of attention, but it's not quite an example of what it is we're talking about. Again, kind of a recap of what the Illinois definition of a retail tobacco store is. This is the definition that's used across all the different acts that might be relevant, okay? It is a business that has 80% of its gross revenue every year come from tobacco or tobacco-related products, okay? It is a space, if a business meets certain criteria, it can have indoor consumption of tobacco. The key thing to remember here, of course, is this, the Clean Air Act went into effect in 2008. Any business that was in operation prior to that is grandfathered in for some of the criteria, like being in a standalone space. If it's in operation after 2008, it needs to be in a standalone space, okay? And also, these cannot have any kind of liquor, food, or restaurant license, okay? A little more about the actual, this is the actual language for that indoor smoking exemption. Again, remember 2008's important date. If it's, and so that freestanding structure occupied solely by the business, that's something that is not always applied to grandfathered in businesses, okay? And then this language is now found in both the Smoke-Free Illinois Act and the more recent Cannabis Act. Basically, this is the thing that we're talking about. A retail tobacco store may, with authorization or permission from you, the policymaker, allow the on-premises consumption of cannabis in a specially designated area, okay? Now, what do words mean, okay? When you're reading these acts, it's important to check the definitions section. If you don't find a word or a term or a phrase in the definition section, what you do is you go to the dictionary and you figure out what the commonly understood meaning of it is, and that's what you go with, okay? But as the city attorney can explain, that doesn't mean you can't have a very restrictive interpretation of it, okay? So if you say specially designated area, depending on how you want to interpret that, it could mean the whole business is a specially designated area, or you could interpret it to mean a specific part within the business, okay? Freestanding structure, okay, well, you might say that's a structurally independent building. It shares no common walls, no party walls. It may also mean that you can't even touch another building, right? So it's just important to keep in mind that these words are not specifically defined by the Act. And even if we go to the dictionary, you can have a stricter or less strict interpretation of exactly what they mean, okay? So, last time I presented, there were some questions about, well, what are other states doing? What kind of examples might we look at? Anyone else here in Illinois taking action on this? I've pulled together some examples, one from here in Illinois and then a few from other states. Big caution note here. Every state has adopted different laws with different rules, okay? So when we begin to compare and contrast, not everything lines up perfectly, okay? So I just want to, there's a big cautionary statement at the front. So, as far as we can find here in Illinois, there's only one community that has moved forward with approving this, okay? And that's DeKalb. A lot of press around this, a number of different articles like the one here. I went ahead and I spoke with my counterpart in DeKalb, their senior planner, as well as the owner of this hookah bar to ask them a little bit about how they had the dialogue we were having, what were the questions that were discussed by their city council, who was in favor of it, who was opposed, how did they come to this decision. Both of those people, who you might imagine kind of represent two very different spaces, said the exact same thing, which is that their city council didn't really have that many questions, didn't really ask for a lot of the research you've asked for, and they just sort of passed it without too many comments. I have gone and read the ordinance that they passed and looked through all 65 pages or whatever. And basically what they did is they had their city attorney draft an amendment where they just struck out every line and every instance where it said, and you can have indoor smoking but not cannabis. And then they just X'd each of that out, okay? So it wasn't a very complex change that they ultimately made. And they didn't really have a seemingly involved conversation about the change, okay? So I commend you on seeking more information. Couple concerns. They don't define retail tobacco stores the same way that the state does. They have a much less restrictive definition. Might be a problem for them if someone looks at it really closely like I did, okay? So this is the only example in the state we can find. Not sure how I feel about how much work really went into the decision-making, okay? But we'll see how it goes. Denver, Colorado. Different state, different rules, okay? This is an interesting thing. So in the city of Denver, they began a cannabis consumption pilot program in 2016. It was a 3-year program where they were going to see how what they called consumption sites worked out. It's basically the lounge concept. Interestingly, the city of Denver did this in violation of state law at the time. And it didn't become a legal program under Colorado state law until 2019 when they passed a Marijuana Hospitality Establishments Act. These on-site or consumption spaces, these, I guess what they would now call hospitality establishments, were very difficult to get up and running. There was a very large regulatory hurdle. I think at a peak, they managed to get 5 of them approved during that pilot period. In fact, if you remember from my previous presentation, that Vape and Play establishment that I showed a photo of, that was one of them. I believe it recently closed. It had some struggles with the business. Kind of as an example of one of the things they included that made this difficult was evidence of community support. So this is pulled right out of their local ordinance. Local community groups and neighborhood organizations had to provide consent for these to operate within their jurisdictions, okay? So they had to go through a really large community neighborhood buy-in process as part of getting a license to do this. Also, interestingly, they wouldn't allow indoor smoking of cannabis in these consumption sites. They would instead have you set up like an outdoor patio so you could consume cannabis in other ways inside, but then you had to still step outside into a non-public patio space to do it. So that's how they did it in Denver. In Las Vegas, things get even more interesting. So in city code, they specifically allow these cannabis consumption lounges and sites. But then state law AB 533 is very, very clear and puts a 2-year moratorium on them, saying a local government is prohibited from licensing a business which allows the consumption of cannabis on its premises or allowing such a business to operate. So again, we find that a city is kind of pushing the envelope with state law here. And in fact, if you look into it, this Nubu Cannabis Tasting Room, which is the thing that gets the most press, it appears on first glance to be inside the city of Las Vegas. If you look on a map, it appears to be. It is in fact not. It is carefully situated on Las Vegas Peyote tribal land. And so whether or not it's strictly legal is a little bit hard to decode, right? Then there's San Francisco, which in California, interestingly, does not allow for these sorts of things, these independent of a dispensary consumption sites. So whenever you're looking at places like Barbary Coast here, which is very lovely, they're only allowed as part of a dispensary, which is the thing we've already allowed, okay? Also, if you go and do some looking at the local news coverage, whenever there is a discussion about a dispensary with on-site consumption opening up, it is not without some controversy, even in places like Oakland, where you might imagine they'd be very progressive and very in favor of it. It's a mixed picture. Some other questions that you had previously were about insurance and liability, okay? So we poked around, the city attorney and I, and we asked some questions of a local insurance company. And they said basically that while there is interest in their industry in providing insurance policies to cannabis lounges as they understand them, there is at present insufficient guidance in state law for them to do it. So they're not really sure how they should assess liability when cannabis enters into the picture, okay? So not that they're not interested, but the state hasn't given them enough information about how to do it. So they're not proceeding. Now, their general liability insurance policies that they have for retail tobacco stores now would not cease to be if this was approved, right? But the policy would not cover anything that was related to cannabis, okay? When I was speaking with the DeKalb Lounge, I asked them about this. They said the same thing, that their current insurer was going to continue to allow them to carry their general liability policy, but that their cannabis-related activities would not fall under that policy. They said that they had gotten 3 quotes from other insurance companies that said that they would offer them coverage for cannabis stuff, but the hookah bar wouldn't disclose who they had spoken to. I don't know who they could have spoken to. I know other states do have insurance companies with policies for things like this, so I'm not entirely clear what the situation is there. So just another thing to keep in mind. Also, and the city attorney is welcome to chime in here if he wishes, we've looked into it. There's no reason to think the city would ever be liable for any sort of accident or issue that came up if these were approved, okay? So city should be free and clear no matter what.
Yeah, it would be the same as any other establishment. For instance, if we have a right-of-way where we've got a 4-inch gap in our sidewalk, we could still be held liable, but it would be no additional threat than any other restaurant or bar situation.
Right. So police issues, and the chief can back me up on this. Right now, when we look around, it's hard to find really meaningful information on crime or other cannabis-related issues. It's not really clear when you look at the data that there's been a jump in crime or a decrease in crime. Asking around to kind of peer cities that have this, I believe you talked with Denver specifically. They don't necessarily bring up any particular incidents that stick in their minds as being associated with this. There's also insufficient guidance right now from especially the state attorney's office. It's kind of our suspicion they don't really want to say one way or the other on certain issues this time. So it's unclear exactly how enforcement across a number of different things should be carried out. And more generally, there's just too few models similar to the one that we have that would assist the police in creating policies on what it is that they should do, right? Again, all of those states, when you start to kind of get into it and do what I did, which is actually go read the law really closely, you discover that they're all different. And so it's not really easy to look at each one and find a model to follow. And I don't know if you want to add anything at this point, Chief.
So as Miles said, we contacted Denver Police Department, but we also contacted 2 municipalities that the council had specifically brought up to see if we could get any guidance from them, and that was DeKalb and Springfield. Unfortunately, or however you want to look at it, neither one had an operating smoking lounge in their municipality at this time, so there was really no data that they could provide to us one way or the other. They had no specific policies in anticipation of smoking lounges within their establishments. So again, there's just very little information out there for us.
Since we last visited with you, the economic development manager, myself, the city attorney, the mayor, and the city manager have all taken a tour of GTI and NTI. We felt we needed even more information for you, and we needed to see things for ourselves. And before I hand it over to the city attorney to talk a little bit about this transporting cannabis issue, I just want to point out this product here that you see, the dog walkers, it's a tin of pre-rolled joints, basically, that come in a little box. And I show this to you so that you can see that pink seal that's on the packaging, okay? So when we were looking at a lot of the packaging being manufactured at GTI, everything always would have a little tab label on it so you could clearly see when it had been opened. And they also all have a barcode on them, okay? So that barcode traces every individual item as it moves from production to the consumer. So that's kind of a little background information on what the packaging actually looks like, whether it's a canister of flour, whether it's something like these pre-rolls, whether it's a candy bar or gummies or whatever it might be. So, and I know Mr. Morrison would like to give a little more context for like this transporting cannabis question.
Sure. So there've been a lot of question about, can you transport cannabis in something other than the sealed container that came from the dispensary? And it looks like we reviewed this pretty closely, and as Miles had said earlier in his presentation, whenever there are definitions, then that means that in a section, that means that the legislature specifically wants us to use that as the definition of this particular item. So when we look at the definition sections in the cannabis transporting portion of the act, they quote, this says cannabis container, and that's in quotes, means a sealed, traceable container or package used for the purpose of containment of cannabis or cannabis-infused product during transportation. So they give they define cannabis container, give that definition to it. When we look a little farther down in the code, a transporting organization's requirements and prohibitions says all cannabis transported by a transporting organization, as opposed to by an individual, must be entered into a data collection system and placed into a cannabis container for transport. So when you're talking about somebody who is, and this is where it's helpful to have gone out to GTI, and so they have secure trucks that go in from GTI. They pick up the products that are all palletized, basically around small pallets. Each one of those containers can be traced back to a barcode, and that barcode seal has to be unbroken when it gets from GTI to the dispensary. The representative from the dispensary that we talked to said, well, if we get some and that seal has been broken, we immediately have to report that, send it back to the dispensary, because we cannot accept anything that is not in a fully sealed cannabis container, and that's as defined in the definition section. When we take a look at or contrast that with what they talk about persons transporting cannabis, they do not use the specific definition cannabis container. Instead, what it says is limitations and penalties. This act does not permit any person to engage in and does not prevent the imposition of any civil, criminal, or other penalty for engaging any of the following conduct. So in layman's terms, it says municipalities can punish people for the following acts, and it says unless it is being transported in a vehicle not open to the public, so your personal vehicle, unless it is in a reasonably secured sealed container and is reasonably inaccessible while the vehicle is moving. So that's a different situation. We're talking about if I'm driving with it in my car, then we're talking about a reasonably secured sealed container and reasonably inaccessible while the vehicle is moving. And you might ask, what does that mean? And that is a very good question, because it's going to be up to someone is going to write a policy as to what that means, or interpreting that policy about whether or not you're going to punish someone or criminalize that conduct. What does it mean to be reasonably secured? What does it mean to be sealed? Is Tupperware sealed? Is one of your, a ball or a mason jar like your grandma used to put her peaches in, is that sealed? What do we mean by that? And they don't give any definition in the code, but it certainly seems to be different than what they call a cannabis container, which is pretty specific, which says it's got the barcode, it's coming from the GTI or for whoever's producing it to the dispensary. So I think what we can fairly say is it doesn't mean that strict. However, it probably also doesn't mean in a baggie sitting in the center console either, it's somewhere in between. And I do think that creates a real problem for law enforcement, because it is what a law enforcement officer might say, hey, what's reasonably secured? And I say, hey, it's in a piece of Tupperware and it's in the center console, that's good enough for me. Police officers might say, well, all you have to do is reach over. And, there are other laws, as some of the council members know, that talk about reasonable access. Firearms are one such law that requires it not to be immediately accessible. So there's some interpretation that's gonna have to be done. I don't think that the city council would be prohibited from saying, we define reasonably secured and reasonably inaccessible while the vehicle is moving to mean the following. But it is something that is going to be problematic for law enforcement in that regard, in my opinion. And so any guidance that might be able to be given to them, I think, would be helpful. And it's also, we're in the middle of an election year. I'm not certain what are the results of the primary or the general election are going to be next fall. So enforcement at the state level anyway, although we still can fashion an ordinance that maybe differs from their enforcement, I don't know what their enforcement policy is necessarily going to be. I think I've got an indication from the current administration, but I don't know if they're going to continue to be the current administration or not. So.
So yay, gray areas.
So I don't know how deep we want to get into this during this study session, but just for clarity,
Sure.
from a legal standpoint, what's the difference between sealed and locked?
Well, that would be, locked, I would say, was probably something that would need a key for entry. I would guess if you're looking at the Webster's dictionary version of locked, I would think it would say something that requires some sort of code or key for entry. I would think that sealed is less restrictive than locked, but how restrictive, is that a Ziploc bag that's zipped at the top? Is it Tupperware? Is it a specially sealed container? My understanding from speaking to the people at the dispensary, for instance, is that for $25, they will sell you a package that, a bottle, it's kind of like a prescription bottle that has a child-proof top and a rubber seal in it to transport, not from their facility, but for you to take home and if you're going to be transporting in your car. That's my understanding. Now, that's not to say that that's their interpretation. Wouldn't necessarily have to be council's interpretation, but I wanted to make you aware that that is what they told me when I talked to them out at the dispensary.
When we did talk to GTI, the growers, everything they sell has to be in some kind of child-proof container, like medicines. So everything had to be. So, once again, if you follow that part through, then even if it's a pill box, or regular emptied pill deal, that would be child deal, would be maybe meet that, start the tone that they're trying to set, the state and that sort of thing to that point. Also, an issue would become for the law officers is what is marijuana that's been purchased legally versus not legally. That if your Tupperware container is now defined as a sealed container, but how do they know how it was purchased, legal or illegal? And if we want to be able to control that definition or the, then we have to set parameters differently and
correct.
tighter to whether it was legal or not.
For the sake of time, I'm going to move on from that.
Thank you.
But it's why I earlier kind of was like hitting on that. What do words really mean? If they don't clearly define what it is in that act, if you can't go to the definition section and see exactly what they mean, it's not so clear. So. Okay, so the other thing that we talked about last time was some possible regulations and some licensing fees. Throughout this whole process, we've kind of compared cannabis to liquor and alcohol because it's kind of the next closest thing we have. For a liquor license, and the liquor commissioner will correct me if I'm wrong on this, kind of the lowest license fee is about $1,100 a year, and most of the application fees we have for things generally are about $100, sometimes $150. Interestingly, right now we don't regulate like bring your own beer, BYOB situations, but I know that's something that we are looking into and may at some point take an action on that's different than what we do now. If we did adopt any sort of regulations, of course, we would try to make sure that they were basically the same as what we've adopted for everything else, having those same sort of separation requirements, the same zoning districts, basically just taking what we've already adopted and making sure that anything else we adopted matched that. There was also something mentioned about placing a limit on the number of establishments that we could license. Certainly can do that. Nothing in state law says that we couldn't, right? So we could really kind of do whatever we felt was best.
Minor correction, the application fee for a liquor license is $900.
Oh, what I'm saying here, and I apologize for not being clear enough, that fee is just kind of the general fee for all things.
that's fine.
There's usually that, but yes, that is correct. So I've hit you with a lot. Obviously, there's still a lot of things that one might want to know. But at this point, again, you know, there's really three choices for you as the policymakers to look at. Okay, I would have offered you more if I could think of any more, but these are the only ones. Again, the first one is to take no action at this time and to revisit this issue in the future. Another, if you're very opposed to this, would be to adopt language that specifically prohibit it. And then the third option would be, if you want to move forward with this, directing staff to craft some language for you to adopt to allow it. And we could build into that almost very little or quite a lot, depending on what it is that you wanted to do. If we did that, we would, of course, try our best to keep it consistent with the rest of the cannabis ordinance that we've already adopted, and make sure that it's just referenced out to state law more than anything else. So as they continue to tweak and update and modify and fool around with that act, our language will always be correct because it just says whatever the act says right now is what we will hold ourselves to. So, covered a lot. What other questions do people have?
I got a few. Regarding licensing, your final slide here.
Yes.
Is there anything that you or our city attorney here is aware of in state code that would prohibit our home rule community from, in addition to or instead of a licensing fee, doing like a per head charge? So for every person who comes through the door, through the turnstile, the city gets $1, similar to our casino.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Morrison. I don't believe there's anything that would prohibit that, though there would be some logistical questions that we would have about that.
Yeah, I wasn't able to find anything. I think there was an email along those lines earlier in the week or last week, and I was not able to find anything that would prohibit that.
Okay, thank you. The current Smoke-Free Illinois Act, who is in charge of enforcing tobacco?
Oh, gosh. There's an office that's in.
They're like the Illinois Department of Health or something.
Yes, and I can't remember. I have made multiple attempts to contact this office without any luck at all. I'm blanking on. I know the person's name. Even.
Okay. So there is a state agency in charge of enforcing. It's not like if somebody is smoking cigarettes inside of a bar here in Rock Island, the police go enforce.
No. I mean, when people are. I have so. What is the name of that office? Do you know offhand?
Enforcement agency.
It is.
Springfield, and they handle all the licensing, the reporting of those quarterly reports plus that yearly affidavit report. They also handle any complaints about violations of the Indoor Smoking Act and separation of buildings and all those kind of things. So there is a place in Springfield. I have those numbers. If you'd like, I would be willing to share.
Yeah. They just never call me back. I guess they don't.
It's all right. Yeah, understandably so. The reason that I ask is if we adopted an ordinance that would allow for non-dispensary cannabis lounges, or whatever word we want to use, if, for example, if a business was suggesting that they were in compliance with the Smoke-Free Act, which is required for them to be a cannabis lounge, do we get involved then and say, no, you can't have your indoor cannabis smoking because you don't have the indoor smoking exemptions or?
I mean, if we believe that someone's in violation of that law, we can definitely bring it to the attention of the state.
Right.
If that's what you're asking.
Yeah, essentially, would that be increased obligations to the city of Rock Island, increased workload to, like, say, hey, you can't have your cannabis lounge because you don't comply with the definition of a tobacco retailer?
I mean, I guess it would depend how much work it took to get the state's attention.
Yeah. So ultimately, legally speaking, the state is responsible for making those decisions and enforcement.
I would say that that's correct, although if we were to try to write an ordinance that contradicts directly the state mandate, then I think,
Restricts it or
then I
something.
think we'd have a problem.
If we wrote our ordinance that says, we allow cannabis cafes in accordance to the Cannabis Act that the state just passed, which refers to only tobacco retailers which meet the definition of the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, then
That would be a non-issue for us, yes.
that wouldn't be us, that would be the state.
Right. Now, if, for instance, say, someone were to say, I don't think they're following the rules or something, I don't know, say there are competing businesses, one of them actually is in compliance and another one is not, one might, but then once again, that's a state enforcement, that's not a city enforcement, but one might say, hey, wait a minute, they're getting more business than me because they're allowing
Right.
X, Y, or Z.
We gotta be conscious of the time, I'm sorry, we gotta be.
One last comment or question. Regarding like the sealed container and things like that, I think that we're having two separate conversations, right? I think what this issue is simply, do we want to allow cannabis lounges? We already are allowing cannabis lounges as long as they're attached to a dispensary already. Do we want to allow stand-alone dispensaries? Now, all of these other issues about whether it's in a sealed container, whether it's accessible when you're driving, all of that stuff is relevant regardless of whether we allow this or not. So it's not like by us allowing cannabis clubs, that's not an issue. It's already an issue, right?
Sure.
Separate.
Yeah, I would think that that's absolutely correct, and I think that the only reason why we went into that was because there was some confusion, I think, on our part, and as well as there were some questions asked directly about that. And on that issue, for instance, prescription bottles are probably the easiest example I can use. We have to use our prescription bottle that we get from Walgreens, and if you have a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday holder, you're actually in violation. Now, whether or not they go around and arrest people for that, that's a different.
I'll talk to the alderman individually and see if
Okay.
there's a consensus.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, appreciate the follow-up. All right, this part's over, we'll come back here at 6:45, start the council meeting.